Welcome back to the front lawn from Diggi Palace at the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol. It is our pleasure to present The Impeccable Integrity of Ruby R. Moni Mohsin in conversation with Supriya Nair. In a cleverly satirical narrative, author and columnist Moni Mohsin's recent book, The Impeccable Integrity of Ruby R, takes on the use of social media as a part of political propaganda and provides an insightful take on the Me Too movement. Mohsin is well known for her long-running satirical column, The Diary of a Social Butterfly, for the Friday Times, and a book with the same name. Her other books include The End of Innocence and Duty Free. In conversation with writer Supriya Nair, Mohsin takes us through the fictitious life of the idealistic and industrious Ruby Rauf, her ambitions, insecurities, and reality. Moni Mohsin was born and raised in Pakistan. She has written 2 novels, The End of Innocence and Tender Hooks, aka Duty Free, and 2 books of collected columns, The Diary of a Social Butterfly and The Return of the Butterfly. Supriya Nair is a books columnist with Mumbai Mirror. She is the editor of a new magazine called 52 and co-founder of the media company All Things Small. Please do remember to comment and ask questions in the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present The Impeccable Integrity of Ruby R, Moni Mohsin in conversation with Supriya Nair. Over to you, Supriya.
Hi, thank you to everyone who's listening, and hello, Moni.
Hi, Supriya.
It is such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. It's a pleasure that many of us at JLF have missed, not just for years now, not just with respect to you in particular, but with our Pakistani friends and the novelists and writers that we admire from across the border for a while now. So this feels like a privilege to me. I also would like, before we begin, to include a shout out. So I was talking to a Pakistani journalist yesterday about a story that I'm hoping to commission from her. And we had a great chat, but I have to say it was very difficult to hear her because of all the tapping and the clicking and the whirring that went on her WhatsApp call. So, to all our to all the workers of the surveillance industries of our 2 great nations, I want to say hello and thank you. And if you could please keep it down, that would be very, very good.
I'm from London, so I hope that there will not be any whirs and clicks and things.
I think Zoom is pretty good about this, but I suppose we're about to find out. Anyway, congratulations and thank you so much for a new novel, which comes quite a few years after the last novel you published.
Yeah.
I think the last one you published was in 2012, I want to say.
Yes. After that, I published The Return of the Butterfly, the columns.
Yes.
But the novel, yes, it's been a fair few years since I published a novel.
I'm delighted to have, reading The Impeccable Integrity of Ruby R just felt like such a pleasure because it was, long awaited. But I'm curious to hear, before we go into the book itself, about what your writing life has been like in the interim.
Supriya, I've been writing this book for the last three years, I think, including the time that I've spent on editing it, etc. Before that, I was working on another project, and that didn't really take off. But I spent many years sort of researching it and thinking about it, and that work never, certainly writing work never goes away. You can always give it another life and another form. And I hope that I will later. But yeah, so I was doing some research and I was writing some stuff and I have written it and I've got it with me. I didn't publish it, but I hope I will.
Yeah, it just feels like from everything I know about the lives of writers, there are so many years in which you just write. And then there's a little space of time in which you become a writer, which sort of seems to be what was going on with you. I know you have lots of fans in India and around the world for The Butterfly, who's your first and most memorable main character in many ways. A sort of a lovely, jovial, perhaps truly warm-hearted idiot, if I may, who unknowingly satirized her life and her milieu, that of a certain slice of upper class Pakistan. And I think those who think of you still as the writer of that kind of, essentially warm satire, which poked fun at a lot of people, but which I think remained quite comic and remained optimistic in some ways. I think the sharpness and the astringence of the impeccable integrity of Ruby R will come as a surprise. As Kritika, who introduced us, said, she's already given people sort of a synopsis of the novel. It's about this young, hopeful woman trying to make her way through this uncertain, really quite cruel world, and a world that's much colder than that of the Butterfly books. I would love for those of our listeners who haven't read the book yet to get a sense of just what I mean when I say astringence. And I wondered if you would consent to reading a little bit from the book to introduce it to us.
Yeah. I don't know if this adequately conveys the astringence, but here we go. So they're at a restaurant in London. Saif Haq is a would-be populist leader, and he's just given a lecture at a college which Ruby attends. Ruby attends the lecture. Ruby is quite apolitical. She attends the lecture and she's quite enthralled by him. And when he invites, or when they all agree to go to have dinner at a local Pakistani joint, she goes with him. And there she is watching him eat there. And so this is it. Watching him tear a naan with his large, sinewy hands, Ruby was struck by Saif's youthful appetite. He did not look like a man in his late 50s. With a flat belly, a full head of crisp black hair, and a tall, rangy frame, he had retained the striking looks of his decades as an action hero. So he's somebody who was an actor before. True, his face was a little craggier than before, but it did not detract from his attraction or vigor. How many times had the fingers, which were now smeared with curry, tightened menacingly around the neck of a sniveling screen villain? He had been the symbol of the righteous, angry young man, always the champion of the oppressed, the voiceless, who is implacably opposed to crooked politicians, greedy tycoons, and brutal landlords. Saif had been universally adored. Women had swooned at his lazy smile, the way he flicked back his hair with a careless toss of the head and gyrated his hips while wooing a doe-eyed heroine with song and dance. Men had admired his abundant virility, his disdain for authority, his determination always to be his own man. In a country with few role models, he had become a towering figure. His mischievous smile was emulated by street urchins. His name was chanted in remote villages. His face, enhanced with rosy cheeks and Bambi-like lashes, was painted in the back of trucks. Before she was married, Ruby's father's younger sister, Little Auntie, would wake at dawn to pluck fresh jasmine buds and string them into a garland to drape around Saif's framed photo that adorned her bedside table. Ruby's older aunt, Big Auntie, a more restrained, sober sort, kept his neatly folded picture tucked in her Marks and Spencer's bikini bottom, her one and only foreign panty in her undies drawer. Supriya, what you said was right. Much. Thank you. What you said is right. This is more stringent, and this is the comedy is still there, but it is darker. It is still satire, but it is darker. But I think it was Tina Brown who said that occasionally all writers must bite the hand that reads them. And I thought that this was time that I did. You're right in saying that I have written kind of affectionate portrayals of the rich and silly in The Diary of a Social Butterfly. And in that, I'm talking mainly about a very narrow elite at the, a privileged elite at the top of the social pile. But that privileged elite presupposes a whole sort of subsection of people below who are not as privileged and who are not the elite. I'm looking at upward from their point of view now. So Ruby is down below, or she at least thinks of herself as being down below, and she is looking up there. And I would also, while I agree with you that the comedy is broader in The Diary of a Social Butterfly, and I may sound grandiose when I say this, but I hope that my writing has not been devoid of moral purpose. That always there is a moral purpose to my writing, even in The Butterfly. So, when I talk about consumerism, I talk about the emptiness of the consumerism in that book. It never actually, whatever pleasure she gets, the butterfly, it's never from, at least the long-lasting pleasure is never from buying the bag, because whenever she buys one bag, she wants the other bag. It's a kind of, it's a bottomless pit of consumerist hunger that sort of gnaws away at her, and the one-upmanship that doesn't give her any pleasure. The pleasure that comes to her is from, in Tender Hooks, is from helping Jonkers find his soulmate, or understanding herself that her soulmate is her husband, and understanding that what she really needs is not necessarily the next bag or the next trip abroad or whatever, but a deeper understanding of the people that she loves. And, I have always tried to skewer hypocrisy wherever I found it, in Diary of a Social Butterfly, in Tender Hooks, in Ruby R. I have always tried to pinpoint political opportunism wherever it is sort of caught my attention. And in The Diary of a Social Butterfly, although it seems kind of a light-hearted, fun, generous kind of satire, it is in fact social commentary and political commentary at the same time.
You are I entirely agree with your reading of this as a reader, and I love that you used the word generous, which was what was going through my mind as you were speaking. The fun of the butterfly comedies is how the butterfly, loses sight of what's important to her, but its fundamentals are so solid because you, the writer, have never lost sight of what's important. And the generosity of those books is in your gently leading her into these realizations of what's important, aside from the sixth Fendi bag or whatever. The world of Ruby R is, though, a colder one, and it's one in which generosity is very hard to come by, and it's one in which generosity often comes at a price. And I'm fascinated by what you said about the crust below the upper crust, and I hope we can return to that. But I want to take off from the bit that you just read and talk about Saif, the character of Saif Haq, before we come to Ruby and some of the others. I've often thought, laughing over the butterfly columns, that you are probably collared by people in Pakistan to ask if you based X or Y on someone you actually know. But with someone like Saif, a lot of people, before ever having cracked the book open, will come to it feeling like they know who it's about. How do you deal with that as a writer?
With a shrug.
Right.
Actually, Supriya, the thing is that everybody is entitled to their preconceived notions, readers, writers, whoever. For myself, I have to say that I have never, ever in all my writing, although a lot of people have said to me, I know, aapne kis pe isko adopt kiya, butterfly ko, मुझे पता है. But in fact, I have never, ever parachuted a real living person into my writing, because they have the capacity to derail your whole creative project, because once you have a real person in there, then you have to start thinking, what would this person be doing, what would they, and that kind of takes your plot all over the place. You have to have the things that you want to talk about, you cannot then, because that person dictates what they will or will not do. So all my characters fictitious characters have always been just that, fictitious. They have always been textured. So that the excerpt that I read to you from, there is no Pakistani politician who is like this. There is no Pakistani politician who has this background of being a 1970s angry hero, sort of fighting the bad guys and being the good guy and always on the side of the little guy. But I gave him that background because I wanted to have that. I wanted to discuss celebrity as well in this book, and how we have this kind of worshipful attitude towards celebrity. And how it becomes, and particularly in the subcontinent, how we become so, accustomed as we are to idols. And because we have such few real role models, that, we insist that that cricketers should become role models, that actors and actresses should become role models, and that if they do or say anything which then does not confirm our biases, they have to fall off the pedestal. It's extraordinary. So I did. Whoever they want to think this is, they're entitled to think that. But I just want to say that this is the creature of my imagination.
You bringing up celebrity in Ruby R, I think, was one of the finest and timeliest. Let me take that back. I hate the use of timely as an adjective, particularly to describe, particularly to praise a novel. But I thought it was one of the finest operations on celebrity on fandom as a way of life in the subcontinent, and in the fact that this is now the world that we live in. This is our politics now, in many countries in South Asia, including yours and my own. Politicians become successful based on how much, based on celebrity, which is quite different from fame or renown. But that's what gets them the votes.
And they pull all these celebrity stunts, like the long sort of vigil and the this and the that. I want to see,
of the poses and the
and clothes and the hair dye and the weaves and give me a break. You can't see Nehru doing that. You couldn't have seen Gandhi doing that. You couldn't,
Yeah, and this is the thing, right? You had a generation of politicians who acquired renown, by which I suppose, these were people who could kind of argue out things in parliament, as well as go and rally thousands of people at a speech and actually keep the wheels of government moving. None of which seems necessary anymore in countries like India and perhaps Pakistan. Which is why one of the things I worried about, because it's 2021 and I read the book in 2020, and we now worry about these things, was that someone who thought that Ruby R was spoke a little too much to the moment in Pakistan wouldn't actually need to read the book to kind of begin some kind of backlash against you. It's enough that they thought that you were criticizing the powers that be, and that they would react accordingly. So my greatest wish for Ruby R, as I think should be our wish for all subcontinental novels written in earnest, is that their readership actually reads them.
Yeah, I think, Supriya, the thing about Ruby R is that I've made it deliberately accessible. I wrote it in a style which was not overly literary. I tried to keep it kind of at a level which was not exactly commercial, but kind of high commercial, or just, so that it would be accessible and that people would be able to read it and understand it and see what I was trying to get at.
Can I ask what responses have been in Pakistan? Responses have been like in Pakistan?
Supriya, this is the thing, the book has been published in India. It's not available in Pakistan yet.
What?
Because, it can't go to Pakistan, and India had bought the rights for the subcontinent. Penguin India has the rights to the subcontinent, and therefore the book cannot go to Pakistan. Now they're sort of, discussion to get the book published in Pakistan by a Pakistani publisher, and it will be very soon. But yeah, the few friends and family who've read the book have enjoyed it very much and feel much the same way as you do. But then, they are my friends and family.
Well, I can't wait to hear what your readers outside of family circles or friends have to say about it, and I suspect they will have a lot to say about it. So I wish it the very best, and I hope it's out in bookstores very, very soon there. This is very shocking to me. I did not realize that not only can we no longer invite writers in person to each other's literature festivals, we also can't access books published in each other's countries.
No.
Sorry, I want to come back to the novel, and I hope we can continue talking about characters a little bit. I told you that one of the things I adored about Ruby herself, who is very young, who is very aspirational, who is deeply recognizable, seemed to echo many sort of classical heroines in novels to me. And one of them was Lily Bart, and you told me just now that you were an Edith Wharton fan.
I'm a huge Edith Wharton fan. I think she's superior to James, Henry James, much prefer her writing. We can talk about sort of my passion for women writers later, but yeah, I think, however, that Lily Bart is a more tragic figure than Ruby. I think Ruby, because she lives in the contemporary world where she has many more choices. Lily did not have the choices because of her birth, because of her time, and because of her social structure or social milieu that Ruby has. I contrast four young women in the book all along. So there's Ruby, then there's her friend Farah, who has much the same sort of background, economic background and social background. She makes different choices. So I want to show that there is the possibility of making different choices. In Lily's case, she is stuck. Ruby is not so stuck. There was another choice for Ruby all along, but she did not take that path. There is perhaps Uzma has less choice than Ruby does in the book. And Kiran, because she is the elite, has the most choice. And I think, and Nasibo has the least choice. It is a factor in our society that I think the richer and the more socially secure you are, the greater your choices. The greater the ambit of your actions. Therefore,
in so many ways, Uzma was the character I found myself melting the most for.
Yes.
You're quite stern with Ruby, and I think, and that's part of the astringence of the book, and that's part of your moral clarity, and I think that's part of what makes the book work. Uzma, for those who haven't read the book yet, is Ruby's colleague when she starts working for Saif Haq and his party, who comes from a more working class background than Ruby, who has had to lie and say that she's working at a women's magazine so that she's going to be allowed out of the house at all, but who in the end suffers much the same sort of betrayals as Ruby does. Perhaps this is a good time for us then, Moni, to return to talking about sort of how you constructed class in this novel. It felt to me that while the class that Ruby comes from, which is this, I suppose in Edith Wharton's time would have been described as shabby genteel,
yes,
and which in our time is described as aspirational, is much larger than that very, very spread thin upper crust that you talk about, and from whom you have a couple of characters, including Ruby's friend, Kiran.
And Faisal.
Right. And Faisal, the dashing man about town who isn't quite. But this aspirational class is one that perhaps 20 or 30 years ago might not have figured in a novel at all, right? It's such a new creation, isn't it?
I don't know. I think in Urdu novels it did. In Urdu, short stories they did. I just want to go back a little bit to what you said, that she's a tragic heroine. I don't think of her as a tragic heroine. I think, Supriya, to learn wisdom, she's 23 when the novel starts, and I think she's about 24, a little over 24 when the novel ends. In that time, she has a very steep learning curve. And I think to learn those lessons early on in life is a very valuable thing. To acquire wisdom early is even if you have to pay a heavy price for it, is a very valuable thing. You talked about female heroines. I was thinking when you were asking that question, I was thinking of another protagonist in a novel who also acquires wisdom later in life, and that's Stevens in The Remains of the Day, who finds out much later, the butler, that he's actually been serving his employer has been almost like a Nazi, has been in his sympathies, for Hitler, etc. And all his effort has been to be the best servant he could be to this man. And he learns too late in life. He's made far too many sacrifices. There's very little for him to go back and find now. In Ruby's case, I think even though the novel ends on a perhaps not on a hopeful note, but she still has avenues. As Farah says to her, you can still learn, you can still go forward. It's not like your life has ended, and it hasn't for her. And I think that part of the reason why, I'll come back to your question about class as well, but part of the reason why I wrote this book was because, I don't know if you've had the same experience, but I've suddenly found on Twitter, etc., particularly, a lot of the people who were friends of mine, people who I thought had the same kind of trajectory as myself, people who've been to liberal arts colleges and Ivy League universities, etc., have suddenly become these kind of tub-thumping nationalists all of a sudden. And, you're facing them suddenly across the picket lines in Twitter and in social media, and you think, what Kool-Aid did you drink? But so many people have convinced themselves that this is the way to go. And, people who were your friends up until 2 years ago or 3 years ago are now bellowing abuse at people like yourself. They may not be doing it to you, but to people like yourself. And that is what made me want to write this book, to think about all of those things which were going on. And I think part of the reason, coming back to class, etc., is that populist leaders are very good at manipulating a sense of grievance. So even when there was a slight, maybe a small resentment, who doesn't have some resentment, they've turned those into these enormous kind of, which are molehills, into mountains of grievance, and said, your grievance should be targeted at that person or this person or that class or that section or that minority. And I've been very intrigued to see how this has been used in politics. And when we talk about class, it is always sort of pitting one class against another. So in Pakistan, there is always, in recent years, there has been this narrative that you are being kept back because of another class. And that may well be true, but also that that they are VIPs or whatever, and that you must hate them and you must overthrow them. And the people who are, and it's the same with Trump, and it's the same with Boris Johnson, the people who are actually do belong to that class and who are dyed in the wool kind of elite. Donald Trump inherited a lot of money from his father. Boris Johnson was educated at Eton, and yet they managed to convince vast sections of the population that in fact they are their saviors, and X, Y, and Z is their oppressor. So I found that very interesting, and I think that in the subcontinent it has been used as a they've used the class narrative and the caste narrative and the religion narrative to pit people against each other so as to solidify their own positions.
One of the things that comes across very clearly in your novel is how this elite secures its own interests at all costs. And even someone like Saif Haq, who can perhaps perform sincerely enough to a vast number of his voters, play this role of as the man of the people. In fact, dances to a different tune. Of course, in the subcontinent, there are so many other, and the elite kind of, in the United States, they half jokingly refer to a deep state of like military and intelligence and, political networks that really runs the show. But in fact, it's money, and it's always been money. Right.
The swamps of Washington.
Yes, that's right. And in the Pakistan of Ruby R, that is simply the guys with money who find ways
and also
around
the establishment. The establishment, which is ever present. Of
course, that's right. Which we kind of glimpse from the side of our eyes in Ruby R. I won't defend my earlier remark about seeing Ruby as a tragic heroine, because you're right in that she isn't. But perhaps what struck me as tragic about her situation was the sense of desperation. And as I grow older in the subcontinent, I feel that desperation myself. And this is no doubt something you're familiar with as well, because I can't imagine how else you could write about it so truly and so clearly. It's this sense that we have brief windows of time and opportunity in which it seems that as women, we can forge new kinds of paths. And then it takes so little for those opportunities to just like kind of collapse in on themselves. And these structures that, that have helped women like us over generations since independence to be educated, to see ourselves as ambitious, perhaps even to see ourselves as being able to make it on our own, to redefine what family and community and society means to us. Suddenly realizing that no, not only is that not easy, sometimes all the choices that look like they're good are in fact terrible. In Ruby's case, though, she really should have known that she was making
She's young, right? Ruby's young. Yes. And Ruby is like a lot of other people we know who are not so young and who are more educated perhaps than Ruby and more experienced than Ruby, who have also convinced themselves that that this is the best thing ever. But I will say, Supriya, that perhaps our experience is slightly different here. Although we both live in deep patriarchy, deeply entrenched patriarchy. In Pakistan, I don't think that the women of Pakistan have ever, or certainly not, I was a kid when General Zia took over. And he was such a palate cleanser in the sense that, he made us all aware that, there were these slogans of Chadar and Char Diwari and passed all kinds of regressive laws as far as women were concerned. So we knew that our opportunities had, the window was closing even then and there. And even women of privilege, even women, very well-known women, famous women, such as Benazir Bhutto, such as the late great Asma Jahangir, who was a human rights activist, such as Malala, all of them have had to struggle so hard to be wherever they are. And even when they are, Malala having won the Nobel Prize, Benazir having become prime minister twice over, Asma being recognized by every single United Nations, or not even United Nations, every single sort of human rights organization in the world, they had to still every day overcome so much hostility, so much rage against them. So the women of Pakistan have really struggled very, very hard. We've had periods of military dictatorship where, Zia's was particularly bad, but then after that, Musharraf, even though he passed legislation for women to protect women, at the same time, he was sponsoring right-wing parties and mullahs, etc. So we always knew that whatever we had to do, we had to struggle. There was never going to be an easy ride for us. And whatever women of Pakistan have accomplished, and they've accomplished hugely, hugely in the last 20, 30 years, they have done so despite the hurdles that have been put in our way, despite the roadblocks, despite the hostility, despite the threats, despite the intimidation. And I will tell you this now, Supriya, the future is female. It will be, and it has to be. And in Pakistan, I am so proud of the young women in Pakistan. Recently, I have had the honor of judging a literary prize, which is just open to women 2 years running now. I've looked at all the submissions, and my God, they are so brave, they are so courageous, they are so acute, they are so enraged. It is so wonderful to read this. I'm so hopeful.
I love having heard that. So thank you very much. And you've left me with new perspective on your novel, which I'm looking forward to going back to. And I have more questions about it, but so does our audience. So I'm going to give them a chance and put their questions to you. Priya asks, your book talks about how Ruby Rauf gets carried away by the charisma of a politician. Do you think getting carried away is okay? Let me add to that. And if you do, in what circumstances?
I think it is very important to have passion, because passion is what changes things in the world, really. And young people are passionate people, and it's great when they do. I was reading somewhere that between the ages of 15 and 25, you are the most open in your mind to new things, and that's wonderful. However, as Ruby learns to her cost, and I think it is okay to be passionate about causes, but it's also important to try and understand more fully what you are committing yourself to read, to understand, to see both sides of the picture if you can.
Riya Shankar asks, having written about marketing and politics, how would you say social media is shaping political campaigns?
It's a double-edged sword, social media. It gives voice to the voiceless, and that's wonderful. But at the same time, there's so much toxicity, there is so much rage, there's so much intimidation. I find all of those sort of things very off-putting. I think it is here to stay. I don't think it's going to go away. But I think governments will have to regulate them. And we've already seen how Twitter has taken Donald Trump off, has deprived Donald Trump of his voice. And we also see how they shut down people when governments complain against them, and yet they do not shut down people who incite violence and hatred. So I think a correction has to come. I think this is going to be there for the future, but either they have to correct themselves or governments have to regulate them, but something has to be done.
I think, algorithms and sort of the men and women behind social media have to understand how easily manipulable their platforms are, and the havoc it's wreaking in countries apart from the US, although it's of course wreaked plenty of havoc in the US. Also, I'm interested to see how. I agree with you, and thank you for that.
But there is a problem with freedom of speech as well. You have to have freedom of speech. So, but at the same time, in the West, you have laws which punish people for slander and other stuff like that. So I suppose that has to also be applied to social media.
Anaya asks, this is related to what you just said, because Anaya has just asked, what is your perspective on censorship? Sometimes there seems to be a rhetoric that we live in a post-censorship world, but clearly that's not the case. She's inspired by the fact that she still can't access Salman Rushdie's satanic verses.
Yeah. Well, I don't believe in censorship. I do believe in freedom of speech. But again, I also believe in laws. Nothing is infinite. If you have to live in a society, there have to be some laws, and as long as it is your chosen parliaments, elected parliaments, which make those laws, I suppose it is, you have to have them in place. You can't have complete anarchy either.
Yeah, and maybe something we're learning now is that speech can only be as free as the society that it comes from.
Absolutely.
And in a relatively unfree society, people like to use free speech as a whip to crack over the heads of those who don't have freedom and who don't. And I can see where the backlash comes from, but there's no doubt that the principle is an important one is very necessary to defend.
And also, Supriya, in places like Pakistan and sometimes India also, where you are stifled and you're muzzled. Social media is very important to get your words out and to get your version of the story out.
Yes, I agree. I think what we are seeing in India, and perhaps, certainly this is something that we must be seeing in Pakistan as well, is that it can feel like a battle in which you are ranged against rather two powerful forces, because kind of these bot armies that now kind of stalk the savannas of Twitter and Facebook can really be crushing. And of course, this is something Ruby in the novel understands very well.
Yeah. And what you live by the sword, you die by the sword.
Yeah. Which makes the last choice that she makes on the last page, which I'm not going to give away, even more fascinating. I don't think we have much time before I have to call a halt to this session. So I'm going to take moderator's privilege to ask you another question, even though our audience questions are still coming in. I want to ask you about your new career in podcasting, Moni. You are now the co-host of a delightful podcast called Browned Off. Ye kaise hua aur ye kya hai?
Kya hua? It reminds you of that song, Ye Kya Hua? It's, Supriya, in this last year, 2020 has been quite a year, So after the Black Lives Movement was sort of erupted again after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of sort of soul searching went on in the UK as well, particularly with its history of colonialism, etc. And, the toppling of statues and the idea of what should and should not be taught and how history should be taught and why isn't Britain's colonial past part of the curriculum of history over here, etc., etc. So we, all of that got us thinking. And my friend Faiza and we started thinking about, why do we not see brown soldiers fighting in Second World War movies? I mean, given the fact that 2 million of them were fighting, and why is it that always, whenever we see a movie about Second World War, it's always plucky little Britain fighting on its own, when we know that in fact it was completely different, that the colonies provided so much manpower and so much blood to them and resources. Also, why whenever we read a novel from the subcontinent which does well in the West, it is always a grim story about either caste or about slums or about terrorism or about why are we not allowed to be funny? Why are we not allowed to write stories like genre fiction, like fantasy, or like whodunits, or like horror, etc. Why is it that we always have to write these novels explaining ourselves to the West? Why must we, whereas they have no such burdens, they can write whatever they like because their experiences are universal, and ours are always to teach the white people something or the other. Why is it that now, at one time, all these novels used to have so many servants in them. And now that immigrants have, taken on the job of servants in the West, and they look after, they're the carers, they're the nannies, etc. They've suddenly disappeared from all novels in white fiction. So we look at the way that modern culture in the West looks at non-white people. and how we have always been in the white gaze. We now want to turn the brown gaze onto them and tell them what we think.
I have listened to the first episode of Browned Off, and I think you have embarked on an absolutely fantastic journey. So thank you and congratulations and good luck for forthcoming episodes. To all our listeners, I hope you will listen to Browned Off. And if you are able to get your hands on the Impeccable Integrity of Ruby R, which you should be in most parts of the world.
Yes.
Yes. Please read it if you haven't already. Anubhav, our moderator, said time out several minutes ago. So I will now dutifully sign off. But Moni, thank you so much. This has been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you. I've so enjoyed it.
I hope, I devoutly hope that I have a chance to speak to you again very soon. And to all our listeners, in person, I really hope so. I will try like many different kinds of red lipstick on, not all at the same time, to discover the best one with which to face you. So to all our listeners, to the panel at JLF, and to our surveillance workers, India, Pakistan, the UK, wherever you are, thank you very much for listening. I'm going to call a halt to this. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Moni and Supriya, for that delightful conversation. If you all enjoyed the session, please do pick up your copy of the book from the Amazon bookstore. And if you are in the mood for some retail therapy, you can go to our merchandise partners, Earth Fables. Do stay logged on for other exciting sessions that we have specially curated for you. We do hope you will be able to support us at Teamwork Arts to bring to you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. Any kind of contribution is welcome. Please do tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you in our next session.